Well, as we progress on the brand to fan show, I'm extremely curious about getting clarity about the mindset of fandom and how we become fans in the first place. And I think there's synergies we can unpack to help all of us understand how to use research and storytelling to build more meaningful connections with those most important to them. So I've invited my friend Mary Nice to the Brand to Fan Show to get her take on this. And Mary knows a thing or two about working with brands who actively cultivate fans. Her career includes stops at the Walt Disney Company, Edelman, and Convince and Convert. Today, she helps clients as a leadership and marketing consultant while also building her own personal brand as the go-to expert in fostering self-awareness to find more career fulfillment and increasing profitability within an organization. Welcome, Mary Nice.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you're here.
Me too.
We have gotten to work together a lot over the last 7 or 8 years, and maybe not so much in the last year or so. We've both kind of been on different tracks as we've kind of found things that we're really passionate about and going to get those. So I'm excited to not just catch up with you today, but really tap into your experience as a marketing leader, incredible strategist. You have such an amazing brain, and I just can't wait to kind of share that with our audience today.
Thanks.
Mary, I want to start like at the very beginning. What were you a fan of from an early age, and how has that fandom specifically maybe shaped your beliefs or your actions as you progressed in your career?
That's a good question. I think me, much like you, have always been a fan of sports. So I think when people hear the word fan, they immediately associate it with sports. It can be so much more, but I am going to associate this with sports because from a very young age, that was just the culture of our family. I was 6 feet tall when I was in middle school, at the end of middle school. And so I was always in sports. Sports was so meaningful to me. And so that was really the first experience that I had with fandom. And so whether it was following Auburn football, whether it was University of Memphis basketball, specifically the women's basketball team, the UT women's basketball team, sport always my first association with being a true fan of something.
Yeah. We should probably put out the disclaimer that you go by the nickname Baby Shaq. No one has ever called me that. And I think that first time we met each other in an airport, we looked at each other. I looked up and you looked down and we were like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You lose that when you work remotely. You don't really understand those height differences. But yeah, I feel like I was born 6 feet tall. So that's I'm an imposing person. Yes.
But you have a kind heart. You are, as your name entails, very nice. And so that is definitely, your height is not intimidating once you get to know the heart of you.
Thanks.
You have spent a ton of your career with marketing departments at big brands, both internally, like being part of the team and then helping teams like this, including higher education, which I know you spent a lot of time in lately. What's changing in the world that your clients need help with identifying or understanding so that they're able to stay relevant?
Yeah, I mean, this list feels endless right now. I'd say the thing that is emerging the most, both on the marketing side of the work that I do and on the leadership side of the work that I do, is just the increasingly felt generational divides between whether you're talking about employees, whether you're talking about expanding your target audience to include Gen Z, moving from millennials to Gen Z, or moving from Gen X to millennials. That divide is felt just increasingly more and more. And, you know, the generational divide and the differences of generations is nothing new. But it certainly is more pronounced now as we have generations who have never known life without the internet and social media in particular. So I see that come up often in my leadership work around team development and team orchestration and becoming a leader. And then I certainly see it in the development of marketing strategies and how you kind of bring new generations into the fold.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I got an email this week and it talked about Generation Alpha as, let's be prepared. And I was like, oh my gosh, my kids have a name, right? My kids now have a named generation that's new. It's not Gen Z. And that's true. They're not. I've had on my website, that I'm a digital native because I hated the word millennial. I hated Gen Y. I kind of renamed, I've grown up, but I actually haven't grown up with the same tools that, someone who's not a quote unquote Oregon Trail millennial has done. So how specifically does that impact like how the team works together and kind of brings people, get them to the same page, get them like pointed in the same direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a technical piece to it, but more than anything, it's a mindset. And true kind of mindset shifts that happen generation over generation. And with Gen Z in particular, having grown up with social media has, in some ways connected them, and in many ways made them more isolated than a lot of generations that have come before them. There was also a recent study. This was a super interesting study just came out talking about how a relatively small percentage, I think it's 16%, say they're proud to be a US citizen. So you have this generation that's coming in who no longer really feels connected to business. They have an inherent distrust of many of the institutions that now employ them. But they also make decisions based on the good that organizations are doing and the vision that organizations have, and they have a really savvy BS factor. They have a nose for BS, right? And so they're not willing to kind of sit by and let things happen. They are active participants and quote unquote, vote with their wallets, right? Whether that's where they choose to work or the products that they choose to buy.
Yeah, I think that is so interesting in just how different that feels to me. And we're seeing that play out. We're seeing that brands have to be more specific with what they think, and then how that and what they truly value, and then how they tell stories about that. In order to attract, the generations that's important to, do they risk isolating like older customers or older employees who really like kind of want to be in the middle? Like they don't want to go to one side of the line or the other. They just kind of want to leave that behind.
Yeah, I think they do. I think it's definitely a risk, but what ends up happening a lot, I think, with brands that isolate is that they try too hard to respond to trends rather than to respond to like the true heart and mentality behind what a lot of this generation believes. Because when we all have these generational stereotypes. It's like millennials are lazy or entitled or whatever, fill in the blank. We all have those generational titles. And Gen Z is certainly no different. But underneath it, understanding and respecting what the beliefs and the experiences have been, I think that's where true marketing campaigns and employment campaigns can come to life without alienating other generations, because it's not like there's this like weird species that all of a sudden wants something completely different, but it's that they want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be included. And so I think that's kind of the bridge that can really tie it all together.
Yeah. Part of my original thesis about kind of brand to fan has been that fandom across generations and how the internet and specifically social media was going to accelerate and heighten the connections that we make online to the things that we love. And as someone who like literally led that charge for the PGA Tour, is one of the like the first person to tweet about professional golf. Like I was watching that kind of play out in real time, and who we were able to connect to, and kind of what that community on golf Twitter looked like. In your research, have you found this to be true with generations that are truly digital native? Like, are they more attached? Are they making deeper connections because we can do this online? Or do you think it's just kind of same tactics, different channels?
So the question, are they becoming more like loyal to brands and
Are
becoming like,
connections faster, deeper, stronger because of these touch points?
yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that I have specific research about it. I will say that some of the early kind of research that I have on the Gen Z and how they feel about brands is that they will be super loyal to brands that are they have to see them doing good in the world. But that if there's a brand misstep, they're gone. So it might be a little bit more like, some people might call it fickle. I think many would call it, I would say more of like a commitment. Like they want to see a commitment that the brands are going to deliver on what they say. So I do think you will see, and this isn't based on any research, but my gut tells me a deeper loyalty than maybe we've ever seen before from a generation. But it's also a deeper responsibility from a brand standpoint, because they do have such a tight connection, whether through social or through, any other digital channels, that it exposes the brand to more missteps.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about in our work with clients, how to show up and how to show up appropriately, because you can't, for every audience at different stages of where they are in their relationship with a brand, they expect kind of different ways. And so to have a brand that's thinking through, and the marketers who are thinking through, like, well, how do we show up at the beginning of a relationship with a person in a specific demographic or a specific need, versus kind of down. And so you have to be nimble enough and flexible enough, and have almost all of these channels created, the landing pages, the right SMS, the right segmentation on your email, to really actually show up in an authentic way. I think that's really hard to do if you don't even know where the brand starts, like where those values start.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think these differences in the generations, it's interesting, from the beginning of time, you like go through these like branding exercises, and you have your mission statement and your whatever, your values and your vision and la, 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 la. And sometimes they're like throwaway exercises, but it's more important than ever to kind of figure out, like, all right, what are we about? How are we hiring people that are somewhat connected to that mission? That doesn't mean that their life mission has to like be the same as you as a company, but how are the people around us supporting that mission and that vision? How is it different? And how can people, really be connected to it? I think it's really important. So, as brands really kind of move forward, that connection and the importance of that being consistent through starting at internal communication, leadership to me has never been so important in delivering it down from the very top. So it's really interesting to see how, there's a lot to be said for Gen Z, but man, they like really push people to walk the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. What responsibility then does an organization and the leaders in an organization have to build connections internally? I think it's now more important than ever to create working environments that are fulfilling and almost safe for their employees. So how do you counsel the leaders at the top to focus not just on the external audiences, but really fulfill that internally?
Yeah, I mean, 9 times out of 10, if you have a crappy customer experience, you probably have a crappy employee experience. And so understanding and really using research to show that the happiness and, of your employees and how they're connected to your mission, and the research that shows how much that matters and how much that affects the customer at the end of the day. Um, you know, I think it's a challenge to convince a leader that it matters. Like if you have to convince a leader that their employees need to be okay coming to work 9 times out of 10, or let's call it 75% of the time, then I'm not sure that you can actually create change in that organization. And so that's really important to me when I take on, clients from a leadership and culture standpoint. If their leader's not there yet and doesn't believe in that, then I'm not sure that you can really make change. So I think it's critical from, the top down that they know it's important. They might not know why it's important and how to make it better, but they do have a core belief that it is important.
Okay. And then that's when they would maybe, if they're teachable, then there's opportunity for change. And if they're resistant to that, if they're resistant to that learning, that development is kind of a sideway part of the conversation. But it feels to me that today you're a mom of a beautiful son, and your son, I think, is the same age as my son, my youngest. We're creating, as parents, I feel like we are creating emotionally intelligent people and giving them the constructs and the language to be more emotionally intelligent than people who are of older generations. I think that we didn't necessarily get those tools because they weren't available to anybody, in the mid 80s. Right. And so I look at the children that we're raising and the emotional intelligence tools that we're building, and just giving language or providing safe spaces to allow them to have conversations or ask questions. Whereas like we just kind of shut up and played when we were younger. Is that going to create, again, like that dichotomy of, can you expect someone in a leadership position who's maybe never had, just now seeing those emotional intelligence tools come to light? Obviously some people are going to be really excited about that, and some people are very resistant to change, but how can you demonstrate the impact of not only teaching the language and the tools required to connect with generations down the line, but like, why is that important for an organization internally?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. But you're absolutely right that, we live in a world, you can, point the finger to whatever you want to point it to, whether it's the media or whether it's social media or digital channels or what have you. We live in a world that lacks nuance. It's always looking for the person to blame at the end of the day. But I think you're exactly right that, we have to look at leaders of an organization that it is a different time, right? Like they grew up in the corporate space in a different time. And that does not preclude them, though, from being open to what we have now learned and evolving best practices. And so the thing that I see as most important from a leadership standpoint is that they are willing to surround themselves with diverse people who have diverse experiences. And when you find a leader who is willing to surround themselves and listen to a diverse group of people, you tend to have a leader that is more both emotionally intelligent and certainly open-minded. And both of those things are incredibly important. When we look at emotional intelligence in general, the higher your emotional intelligence, the lower the job turnover. So making sure that you as a leader are committed to understanding it and really teaching it in your organization is pretty important. So anyway, I'm not sure where that winding part of the conversation is going, but I think from a leadership standpoint, that who you surround yourself with is going to be potentially the most important thing in being able to see your organization really evolve.
Yeah. Well, let me try to steer this back on track. How has your work with marketing leaders and with their teams inspired you to create more content and kind of build your own brand around talking about this for women like yourself? How did that get started for you?
Yeah. So there's a couple things that like really spurred me on. During the pandemic, I felt like from all angles, every kind of workplace that I touched, whether it was former Disney colleagues, former Edelman colleagues, people that, clients, stuff like that, were kind of coming out of the woodworks with these questions about like, what am I doing? Like, what is this work thing? And I'm working too hard and I feel like nothing is like going my way. Is it all worth it? Should I just like put it, hang it all up and do something different? If I did something different, what is that? People just kind of confronted this idea of fulfillment really, and what fulfillment meant for them and where they could find that. And I was feeling a lot of the same stuff. I think COVID made us all feel that stuff. And so I became kind of obsessed with really neuroscience research and looking at the science of beliefs and emotions and how those things and how those early beliefs can really shape our perception of how we walk through the world. And so what I do now is try to help people better connect with themselves first, really understand and become more self-aware. We talk about self-awareness as if, I first started studying self-awareness. I used to think like, it's that like obnoxious person who comes into a meeting who like can't read a room, like they have no self-awareness. But truly, like if we're going about the world and we can't really identify emotions, we can't work through feeling complex, different emotions, like that is a lack of self-awareness. I think the stat is 95% of people say they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% of people actually are self-aware. So generally, most people are not walking around self-aware. And so I just became really obsessed with this because it was an area that I believe we have more control over than we think if we really knew where a lot of these feelings came from. And so I think that is somewhat of what people were searching for, where it felt like life was so out of control. Like, what is something tangible that I can control? And for me, that came to life through some of the consulting that I'm doing. And so it's been really interesting to really dive in and connect not only like societal and cultural conditioning, but then what that does to our brains and how we move about the world and how that presents itself in the workplace, whether that's individually, with a team, or with leadership. So that's a lot of the work that I do now.
That's awesome. And I love following you. I love listening to your online videos and following your
Thanks.
your newsletter. I think it comes at a good time for me, right? As I'm also transitioning in careers and looking for, making sure that fulfillment is important to me and getting that in a lot of areas of my life. So as a fan of yours, I appreciate that. Talk a little bit about like what channels you chose and like what medium you chose to like really put this message into the world, and what did you learn from using videos specifically and then building your newsletter?
Yeah. So I think when I designed I wish I would tell you there was like some big strategy behind it. But I just started. I started with TikTok mostly because I was trying to figure out what the heck TikTok was for a lot of the client projects I was doing. So I was like, I'm just going to start on TikTok. And then that kind of was my first, it really blew up. So I just kept at that. And as the TikTok audience got a little bit older, it was starting to be more of the people I talked to. Cause I generally help people that are either like, they're pretty far into their careers. So like mid-level to like senior level people. And so then I started doing it on Instagram, which originally I was really hesitant on because people knew me on Instagram. Like, this is where my friends were, this is where my colleagues were. And I was worried about what people would think. Like, who is this woman who thinks that she can talk about this? So TikTok was a very anonymous place for me to be at first. And then added LinkedIn, which was even more scary for me because it was all colleagues, it was former bosses and clients and all that kind of jazz. And then I started my newsletter. So it was all, it wasn't necessarily this big strategic unrolling of it. It was more what I felt kind of called to at any different time. And only now am I somewhat becoming more systematized with it. So I've finally hired some help, who are helping me really think through kind of what the rollout of the content, making sure I'm using my time wisely, all that kind of jazz. But for the most part, it's just been where my heart's kind of calling me and following through there.
And I can't imagine that I'm not the only fan of yours. I'm not your only TikTok follower. What does it feel like to be in a position where you're cultivating like followers, but you probably also have identified a segment of fans within those followers who are like, I mean, if you do a wellness weekend or some sort of retreat or something like that, like people are going to show up for you. And what's that like to be like kind of
Weird
doing that for the first time?
Yeah, it's really weird and kind of uncomfortable. I was in where my mom lives in Georgia, and I went into like this store, this like women's clothing store, and this woman who I'd never met was like, I feel like I know you. And then suddenly she was like, you're very, very nice. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is weird. It was so weird. And I think it's weird no matter what, you know. I can't imagine anybody is like, oh, that feels totally normal. But I also think as women, you know, we're conditioned to really be small, and to really stay in a small space. And so that even presents more of kind of cognitive dissonance of like, okay, all of a sudden you're taking up space and people notice and you want to kind of shrink back down. And so, it's a weird feeling, but it's also, it feels good, like to know that the messages that you put out are impacting people. And it's, you know, I'm so grateful every time I get a note back from an email that I've sent out on whether it's a man or a woman, wherever they are in their career. Like, it feels really good to know that people feel seen and feel heard and that you help people. So it's great.
Oh, I love that for you. I really do.
Thanks.
Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about your early, you know, fandom and how that kind of revolved around sports, and maybe that led you to make some career or some choices about where you went to school or that kind of thing. But one of the questions that we always ask on this podcast is what are you a fan of today? And I want to ask that a little bit earlier in the show, because I also want to unpack maybe like that opposite feeling of fandom, or that like when you become a fan and then you maybe what happens on the other side of that. So let's start with like, what are some of the things that you are a fan of today?
The one that comes to mind first, because it's like present in our daily life, is the Tony box. Have you seen the Tony box?
No.
Are you familiar with this?
No, tell me.
Okay. The Tony box is it's a soft speaker. And you get these little figurines and they sit on top of the speaker, and it's like a 90 minutes of children's programming of like reading stories to kids. So like they have Mickey Mouse ones and PJ Masks and Curious George and, you know, all these characters, and Smith loves it. And so, you know, it reached a market. It's one of those ideas you're like, damn it, why didn't I think of that? Because it's so brilliant. But it reached a market of parents, I think, that knew that they didn't want a lot of screen time for their kids, but also are flipping exhausted and don't have the capacity to read story after story after story after story at night to their kid. So now Smith, like, we go in and we read a couple books, and then he puts on a little Tony box. You know, he picks out his character, puts it on a box, and it reads to him. And it was so well designed for kids, you know, that he loves it. And he chooses that now instead of screen sometimes, which is like absolutely mind blowing. So that's the huge win. It's such a great utility. And such a great, like, I tell everybody with kids about it now, you know, because it's amazing.
Yeah. Okay. I'm totally looking that up for my youngest as well, because we're kind of stuck in this like loop of calm bedtime stories, which is fine, but we always go back to like the same two. And then he gets like, I want to try something new, but no, I'm always going to go back to these. We're going to try the Tony.
And it's always the worst books. They always like the worst, most boring, obnoxious books that you don't want to read anymore, you know, over and over and over.
As someone who can worst books, this doesn't fall into worst books, but my oldest son is 9 and we can still recite. Like I could tell you the Little Blue Truck story from
gosh, it's
memory.
so cute.
Like no problem. Like we could
Oh
just
yeah.
turn this into a dramatic reading of Little Blue Truck.
Yeah.
Beep.
Yeah.
Totally.
But that beats the hell out of Blippy head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Okay.
It sure does. Sure does.
That's our
to wrap this tangent, my husband showed me an article last night in our local in the Oregonian, and it was about how Kids Bop is going on tour. And the first paragraph of the article is like, if you don't know what Kids Bop is, stop reading immediately so you can save yourself.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say, like, maybe not fans of some things as well. Whether we were maybe fans for a microsecond or are people who have influenced our choices, are fans of. Is there a time that you have been a fan of a brand, a product, a person, and then over time, like fell out of love? Like, what's that relationship like? I'd love to hear your experience of that.
Yeah. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Auburn for me, Auburn football for me. Which is, your face says it all, like is shocking. How do you fall? Like I loved Auburn football. I loved all Auburn athletics. It was so important to my family. Like it was just a deep love. And for me, as I had a lot more on my plate, being a mom, being a wife, being a business owner, I kind of gradually stopped watching as much. But then they made some moves that just really were disappointing to see from like an administrative standpoint. And for me, it was hard to come back from that. And so it's been like kind of a hard thing to let go of. But I feel less of an emotional attachment to the university. And I think it's something that could have potentially be, there could have been some better communication about it. But ultimately, I think, when you love an institution and they make some moves that you don't necessarily agree with that really show their priorities, then there's nothing that they could do to keep me as a fan. Right. And ultimately that's their decision. So, and then it's my decision on, do I still donate to this school? Do I still go to games? Do I buy my kid an Auburn jersey? All that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the moves that they make aren't necessarily about keeping fans like myself. It's about the fans who win above all cost. And so, culturally, it just didn't align with what was important to me. So it's been kind of a tough emotional breakup, but that's like more of an emotional one for me. But then there's plenty of instances of brands who I've been really big fans of that just somehow didn't have enough staying power for me. Whether that's, hey, you kind of grew out of it and into something else, or whether it was really great for a time in your life and now you're in a new season. Sure. So there's plenty of examples of those too, but the one that feels like really in the heart right now is Auburn.
Yeah, I get that. I think it's interesting because we talked earlier about being declarative about brand values and staying true to kind of what those are, because certain audiences need to see that to really form that emotional connection with your brand. And I think like as an advisor to higher ed or to brands who are willing to kind of plant that flag on one side of a line or the other. Like you said, I'm not the core audience member. And so it's okay that they chose to do this thing. Now, as a fan, I have a choice to either go along with them or find something else. It's a new season in my life. If you're sitting in the room and that conversation is taking place of like, where do we plant the flag and is it too far in one direction or the other? Do you encourage those leaders to still take that stand?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on ultimately what the most important thing is for the leadership. And would I have told the leaders of Auburn would I have consulted them in a different direction? I sure as hell would have, because my belief is that they've made some decisions that don't align with the creed of Auburn, and what Auburn really stands for. Now, that is ultimately a decision that they have to make on what's the most important thing for them. But I mean, you go back to how much do you want to live out your brand values? How much do you want to live the things that you promised? And how important is that to you? In some cases, I think right now college athletics is among the messiest, most complex, nasty places right now. So that's a really hard place to be. And a lot of really hard decisions are having to be made. But ultimately, if you're not, from a leadership perspective, my consultation 9 times out of 10 says, go back to your brand values. And are you ready to live those out or not? Because most times there are hard choices to be made. Many times there are great compromises. And, when we become so married to it's either A or B and don't do enough to open up the options in front of us and get that kind of tunnel vision, and you get the people around that are really pressuring you to pick A or B, and you don't do the work to really open it up, then you're kind of caught in between a rock and a hard place. But yeah, I mean, I think if you don't use your beliefs to really guide you at the end of the day, you can really make some big missteps.
I love that. That's like a mic drop moment right there. We'll make that tweetable in the show notes. Thank you. The other question that we ask everybody who comes on the Brand to Fan show, as you know, as the CEO and founder of FanWagon, the re-commerce marketplace for fanwear, I have to ask, Mary, as a huge sports fan yourself, what is the favorite jersey or piece of fanwear that's either in your closet now or you can't believe you got rid of?
I think I have 2. One is I have an old WVU hoodie that was my husband's, which, it's just like soft and big and comfy. And I do have a lot of affinity for West Virginia, where my husband's from and went to school, and has been such a welcoming place for me. I think it's so beautiful up there. And then my other one is, it is an Auburn jersey, and it is an old Cadillac jersey, which was number 23, which was, I just love having that. It kind of reminds me of the good old days. So those are the 2.
I love that. Well, Very Mary Nice is your TikTok handle. Where can our audience keep up with you and follow your work?
Yeah, you can find everything on my website, marynice.com.
Awesome. Well, that makes
easy enough.
Put a bow on it right there.
Yeah.
Let me put a bow on this conversation. Today, talking to Mary, we talked about how you must, as an organization, stay true to your brand values and really ask yourself the question, are you ready to live those out or not? The reason why that's important is because especially younger generations who are coming to work for you or coming to buy from you are more skeptical, and they expect more from the brands that they transact with. That deeper loyalty requires a deeper responsibility from your organization to live up to those expectations. And that starts with leadership. Leaders need to be willing to surround themselves with diverse voices and experiences to build more cohesive teams and more fulfilling workplaces. What do you think?
You got it. That was really good.
Thank you.
I need to transcribe that.
Well, she is Mary Nice, and I am Lauren Teague, the host of the Brand to Fan show. This is the podcast that unpacks the phenomenon of fandom to help you build for the future by creating more fans. We talked about show notes. You can find those for this and every episode on brandtofan.show. If you are a fan of Mary Nice, go follow her on marynice.com. And don't forget to follow us, subscribe, rate, review, and please share this podcast episode with someone who you think would love to hear it. Thanks again for joining us today. We'll see you next week.